Hi there and welcome back to UnHerd. As you can see, we are out of our normal London studio, and this is a theoretically soundproofed but apparently not very soundproof box within the Dissident Dialogues festival here in New York. And I just had to catch up with my friend Michael Shellenberger.
Great to be with you, Freddie.
And Jake Siegel, who is over from Israel, where you are normally resident.
Yes, back in Brooklyn.
So, obviously, what I want to talk about, because I'm the new guy to the party here, you have both been working on disinformation, anti-disinformation, the censorship industrial complex. Michael, as you christened it, did you not? You actually, Jake, writing a book about this. Mike, first, how long has this been kind of a big issue for you? And what did I just completely miss out in our late to the party discovery of this?
Well, complex? I should first say that when I heard that you had been the target of the Global Disinformation Index, I was thrilled because, welcome to the party. Another person that I admire and love has been censored, and that's always a net benefit to the pro-free speech movement. I'm not being entirely facetious. I think it's important, and I put the bottom line up front, there are big problems for the censorship industrial complex. The first one that most people are familiar with is the Streisand effect, which is that if you censor somebody, it's a big story and deserves to be a big story. So that's one of the problems that they have in attempting to censor. But the other one is that in this mania to, which I think is really driven by intolerance and dogmatism, in this mania to censor and disparage different voices, dissident voices, they end up widening the circle too broad. And so you end up censoring people for things that are obviously factually true or narratives. And this is another tension. I mean, they say they want to censor, inaccurate information, but then they say, we're really about stamping out narratives we don't like. Another step that they've gone too far. They really got full of themselves. I think it's the extent to which that the censorship industrial complex leaders have become true believers in a kind of, holy war against misinformation. I think it ends up bringing in very mainstream, and I think of you as a mainstream
soggy centrist.
I think of you as a very soggy centrist, Freddie. I mean, not in a loving way. No, I think you start to see more and more people swept up in it. I certainly was aware of it when I was censored for giving accurate information that was considered against the mainstream narrative on climate change in 2020. That was my first awakening to it, but then it really went asleep until the Twitter files at the end of 2022.
Jake, I just want to bring you in because we actually did an interview about the disinformation cult, I think, or I can't remember how we headlined it, but its complexity, the deep way that its tentacles reach into the rock or the edifice of our culture, I had not fully understood until we were researching this example. You're writing about this. How should we begin to understand the structure of this censorship-based beast?
We should understand it as a form of government and a form of power. So censorship is a symptom of that form of government, an expression, a tool that form of government uses. It happens to be one of its primary tools. But the proper framework for it, I think, is to use its own terms, which is as a whole of society and a whole of government effort, something that leaves, in a classically fascist or totalitarian sense, something that leaves nothing outside of government. That's its ambition. It doesn't pursue that using the same means and procedures as classic 20th century totalitarianism. It's evolved beyond that, and there are other ways in which it's quite different from classic 20th century totalitarianism, but it shares the same desire and self-righteous claim to a totalizing control over information.
And it uses liberal language to describe itself.
Sometimes it uses liberal language to describe itself. Sometimes it uses explicitly what you might call, sort of a therapeutic progressivism that steps beyond the kind of respect for liberal individual rights and enters into a territory of kind of, a claim to protect people against the realm of harm that threatens them from every direction, and which safety, harm reduction, safety, which provides the regulators and the state itself with a totalizing claim based on protecting people. And this leads to the kind of overreach that Michael is describing, because the aim is totalizing, because Americans, English people are not accustomed to totalizing systems. This produces a tension. It opens up a kind of fragility in the system because it inevitably overreaches. It is, by its nature, overreaching.
So I'm going to force you, if I may, to think about the example that touched us. I will stand accused of egocentrism, solipsism, and much else, but it's the example I know the best, and I've spent the past few weeks deep inside it. And what has been interesting to me is, first of all, the complex structure, right? So we had engaged an advertising agency. That agency then engaged this machine called Grapeshot, which is part of Oracle. And that, in turn, engaged the GDI to get this live data on whether websites were quote-unquote dangerous, disinformation, etc. So it's 4 stages into the beast, and we almost discovered it by accident. Most people, I think, even the CEOs of probably some of those companies, I mean, this Oracle, Larry Ellison, is a Republican as far as I understand it. I don't know what his views are on this, but he's previously committed not to use the GDI, and apparently his organization still is. I actually corresponded with Elon Musk about it. Twitter is apparently using GDI via something called Integral Ad Services, which is another one of these ad buying platforms. And there he was on Twitter saying GDI should be shut down and the miscreants should be published. So you've got this weird situation where the heads of these companies don't even understand the beast that is happening further down. And I say that we've had momentum in Parliament, a lot of media attention, and a lot of, I would say, forward momentum, but the beast is very much still out there. They have said nothing. They have completely gone to ground, and it's been a very effective PR strategy because ultimately there is only so much you could write. And they figure that, I presume, that they will just survive this through silence. And they're so well hidden that the story will move on.
Yeah.
What advice would you give to us and to other people in a similar situation about, like, how can we root out these strange, malevolent bureaucracies and destroy them?
God, so I have so many reactions to that. I mean, I think the first, so I think for me, what I'm inspired by in this conversation is that with every new case, you start to see the contradictions and the problems within the censorship industrial complex. So I mentioned Streisand effect, mentioned the kind of the widening net. I think the other one, though, is that what they've done is they've created for us a lot of situational awareness. I mean, it's funny because I actually find myself using their language, which is really language that comes out of intelligence agencies, situational awareness. So we have a much better sense of how they're operating. I mean, I've learned something just now from you. Also, we started creating a list of persons of interest. Matt Taibbi last year, working with Andrew Lowenthal, created a list of organizations within the censorship industrial complex. It was overwhelming. First of all, there's too many organizations, but there was another problem with it, is that these guys start organizations and then shut them down frequently. They just little pop-up organizations with a specific
COVID variants.
Yeah, these are like front groups.
How intelligence agencies have classically operated through shell organizations.
100%. And so we were like, really what's interesting are the people. So we learned that they create lists of persons of interest, or POIs. So we've got a report coming out on persons of interest, because you sort of go, oh, that person was in Medan, and, that person was in Stanford Observatory, or that person was here, or that person was there, and so you start to see the people popping up over and over again. I think one of our disadvantages is that when you look at a particular person, like we're very interested in Claire Wardell, who was at Brown University, and we kind of go, it seems like there's some ties to intelligence agencies. We can't actually see them. But when you see all these people working together over time, you get a much clearer picture that this is what we would consider counterpopulism. This was clearly an orchestrated event after the revolutions of 2016 to fight against populism. And I just got back from Brazil. I'm currently under criminal investigation. I may be prosecuted in Brazil for publishing 100% legal and accurate information. But that also has provided me with real insight into how this beast operates, what's similar and what's different between countries. So I think that we are catching, like a year ago, in June of last year, we first all met in London, and the Westminster Declaration came out of it. This year, we're all meeting again in London. I think we are getting
UnHerd Club.
at the UnHerd Club. And I think we're getting closer and closer. In other words, I think the distance in time between the operations that these people are carrying out and our ability to detect them, I think we're getting closer and closer. Remember, we were talking about the Hunter Biden laptop 3 years after it happened, or 2.5 years after it happened. And now I think we're able to see operations occurring in real time. Recently, we had a Czech Republic journalist write about a disinformation operation run by the Czech intelligence and Polish intelligence, aimed at basically smearing conservative parties as Russian funded or Russian linked. We're able to see it in real time. So anyway, it's a long way of answering your question to say, if you think you're under attack or you're being censored or there's some operation going on, investigate it, write about it, expose it. That's, I think, the main event right now. We've made a strong statement for free speech, but some of it's just, pulling out into the sunlight.
So let me inject what I think is a useful cautionary note, and I agree with all of that virtually. But I also think that once you recognize that this is a whole of government, whole of society effort, what you're really looking at is a class, a ruling party. And the ruling party, you might say that its core is the sort of defense establishment that is actually really the NATO defense establishment. It's not the U.S., it's NATO, Five Eyes, as you saw through your experiences in the UK. The defense establishment is the core, and then the sort of organs of the ruling party in the respective countries where this is in place are the core of this class. But the class itself represents a concentrated form of political power. And corresponding to that concentrated form of political power, it has its own prerogatives in terms of the kind of policies it wants to implement, in terms of the direction it wants laws to take, in terms of opposing populism.
It's just a sort of technocratic establishment worldview, isn't it? I mean, look, we've just been a victim of it, and yet I feel there's something about the conversation that almost feels too paranoid. And I know we might disagree on that, and we could probably spend hours on to what extent it's directed or emergent and the rest of it, but the woman in question who founded the GDI, someone called Claire Melford, I am almost 100%, in fact, I feel like I'm 100% certain that she is doing this in good faith. I recognize the type of person she is. I have known many people like that. It's not a distant class to me. It's basically the class I emerged from. I could have been at university with her. She and many people like her will feel they're really doing a good thing here because there is, danger out there, that the channels of information are being corrupted and innocent people are going to be harmed. And, that's what she's devoting a portion of her life to doing. How do we sort of square that rather than taking an overly simplistic view that it's all a sort of nefarious conspiracy? How can we persuade that class that these kind of measures are not actually going to help?
Well, look, I mean, nothing occurs at this scale, whether good or monstrous, without relying on people of good intention. So this is not to impute nefarious motivations to people. The point of focusing on the sort of class is because classes have interests. And so if you want to oppose this, you have to understand what this class's interests are. And certainly it's technocratic. And the interests of a technocratic class are power through administrative regulation. But also, that technocratic class is now wedded to the defense establishment. So the anti-populist apparatus that Michael was describing didn't actually start with Brexit and Donald Trump. That actually really began in its modern form a bit earlier, really in 2014, and it came out of the NATO defense establishment's doctrines and theories about hybrid warfare in relation to Russia's invasion of Crimea, the Euromaidan protests in Ukraine, and how Russia was seen to be operating there, and ISIS and ISIS's social media campaign. So the idea that seizing control of the internet was a existential national security imperative started in 2014, looking outward at foreign threats, and then was turned inward to respond to the domestic threat of populism in 2016. And that was when, in 2016, was when the sort of liberal, progressive technocrats joined with the defense establishment. So having said all that, I think that where that leads us is to recognize that, the form of power that is at work here, which is secretive administrative regulation based on claims of existential security risks or existential political risks or safety risks, etc., that you have to look to the politicians, the movements that oppose that kind of exercise of power, which is inherently secretive in the context of the U.S., extra-constitutional, and that, that's crucial to me.
Michael, would you allow for any anti-disinformation apparatus? I wonder whether we advance our cause by making small concessions in a way. And, when I was at the House of Lords doing this committee, I said I can think of examples. If there was a massive NHS data breach and millions of people's personal health records were suddenly available, I can see the case for the government to take measures to prevent that becoming widely spread. That's an extreme, maybe easy example. What other ones are there? What would you concede to people who feel something needs to be done about disinformation?
Well, I think we have a really great anti-disinformation system right now. It's called freedom of speech. And I've written 2 books, 400 pages each one with 100 pages of endnotes. I wrote those books because I really care about the misinformation and the harms that misinformation causes. It literally never crossed my mind that the solution to the misinformation I was criticizing, whether on climate change or on drug addiction, that the solution was to have a small committee of experts decide what the newspapers and the social media companies could print. Literally never crossed my mind. I mean, and if you had told me there was an option, I would have been like, that's absurd. Like, why would you do that? So I think that we have to understand, we have to view this at multiple levels. I think there's definitely a financial interests that are at work here. I mean, the level at which the mainstream news media have an interest in engaging in the censorship of their competitors, it's very powerful. It's a lot of money. In Brazil, for example, the newspapers are now getting a lot of money from the government. And you see that happening more in places like Canada and Australia, but I think it's going to start happening in the United States and elsewhere. Financially, you see political interests, like I think what Jacob was just talking about, basically the protective international order. And all those people view themselves as caretakers and protectors. It's elitist. They look down on, working people. The demands for censorship are not coming from the guy that's, parking your car or driving Uber or working at the grocery store. It's coming from educated elites. And then I think there's a third part of it, which is just that some of this is very pathological. I think that the intolerance that you've seen rise, the sense in which that, we have to shut you up, that it has an independent agency to it separate from the security state. And you see it often. In Brazil, I'm struck by the really powerful Supreme Court judge, because the censorship apparatus in Brazil is located in the Supreme Court. It's very different from in most countries where it's in the executive branch. But they're censoring like people saying mean things about them. I was sometimes struck by how petty the censorship demands were. And then I was reminded, totalitarianism had a pettiness to it as well. You go give a bunch of bureaucrats this extraordinary power and they get lifeguard syndrome. They're teenagers with this crazy power to censor, and they're going to start doing it for anything they want. So I think that there is my pessimistic view is that there's huge, powerful forces. My optimistic view,
the answer to the question of whether we should concede anything, the answer I'm hearing is no. Basically, are there scenarios that you think we should be censoring disinformation? Do you think there should be any organizations devoted to, for example, looking at the quality of websites, identifying Russian bots, etc.? Or would you be an absolutist and say the slippery slope is too dangerous?
Well, that's not where I draw the line. In other words, I go out and I identify misinformation and I criticize it and I want to debate it and argue with it. So there's nothing wrong with doing it. There's also nothing wrong, I think, with suggesting that something is Russian financed, that you have to have the evidence. There is something wrong about weaponizing your intelligence agencies to spread disinformation against your political enemies. That's against the law.
We can all agree on that.
Yeah. And so I think it's just, I don't think that the lines are super hard to find here. It's, if fighting misinformation is just a way of describing, arguing and debating and presenting evidence, it's great. If it's a way of saying we need to have a secret committee to decide what's true and false and go and demand the social media companies censor it behind closed doors, as occurred during COVID. And we had a new piece of information just come out yesterday that the White House asked Facebook to censor the debate about COVID's origins. I think that's obviously wrong. I mean, that's censorship, and that's something we can agree we're against.
There's a crucial distinction here between censorship of domestic political speech and actions taken to counter foreign state information operations, let's say. Now, of course, there may be areas where those lines can get blurred, but in the U.S., the Constitution protects American citizens. So it doesn't protect Chinese citizens, much less Russians or Chinese intelligence agents or Iranian intelligence agents. So there is a space, I would concede there is a space for counter-information operations. The crucial measure to prevent those from turning into instruments of repression is first to maintain the firewall between what we do overseas and what we do domestically. And that's precisely what the disinformation apparatus in the U.S. has systematically dismantled.
So you want to reinstate that firewall?
It's crucial.
Yeah.
And this is from the very beginning, the leaders of the counter-disinformation, government counter-disinformation, people at the State Department's counter-disinformation efforts, the academics, virtually all of these people were saying, we have to take down the firewall because of the internet, because of how...
And of course, because of the paranoia around Russiagate,
precisely.
And where domestic politics somehow could still be manipulated by foreign power.
Russia could sneak in through the open internet, through social media, and essentially infect domestic political actors in the U.S. So they were trying to break this down. We need to reinstate that wall. That's the first thing. And then the second thing is we need transparency. We need actual accountability, which is crucial in a democracy. And this is what the intelligence agencies resist. And so where they are carrying out these measures, especially, where they touch on domestic political speech, but even where it's strictly dealing with foreign actors, there has to be accountability. There has to be transparency so we know what they're doing.
So I think a lot of people would agree with a lot of what we have said so far. The agencies working against your own citizens, censorship. I think you would get a majority in a popular vote against that. Where it gets harder and where I feel most vulnerable is the free market, essentially. In our example, the reason we considered legal options, and we were advised that it wouldn't be effective, because the GDI is technically providing their personal advice, their opinions, to corporations as to what would be brand safe and what wouldn't. And corporations value their advice and therefore take action on it. So it points to this bigger sort of structural issue, which is that corporate money, advertising, doesn't want to be associated with anything politically incorrect. I know there's examples, the few examples of successful media startups recently, their business model is a hell of a lot easier if they are absolutely in the center of the politically correct parabola. And suddenly, we're going to do events for Diageo and global corporations. Suddenly, the business model works. If you ask uncomfortable questions and are more politically incorrect, it's a tougher world out there. I don't know if there is an answer to that, but I just wanted to see if you have any thoughts that, yes, we can go after clandestine agencies, nefarious entities. What do we do about the market terror of anything, quote unquote, politically incorrect?
I mean, this is the hugest question in media right now, which is how do you finance reporting? I mean, I think it's not shocking that there's so much commentary right now. Commentary is basically free. You get up and you talk into a microphone and you comment. So a lot of people can do that to the extent that people pay for it. You can make a living as a commentator. How do you fund investigative reporting where maybe you don't write a story for a full year? Right now, it's basically either a philanthropic enterprise, ProPublica being the most famous, but also my own organization on a much smaller budget is doing some of that. And we have a nonprofit research organization that can do longer-term research projects like the WPATH files. And then there's the big corporate media, but then the constraints there are just what you described. The advertisers are paying all these people to basically tell them where the Overton window is. I find it a little bit asinine, obviously. It's pretty obvious in my view where the Overton window is. Just read the newspaper.
In the wrong place.
Yeah, usually.
Often.
If you want to move the Overton window, which is what any investigator wants to do, you're discovering information that suggests that the window's in the wrong place, how do you finance that? I don't think anyone's going to come up with any solutions we don't already have. I think it's going to be philanthropy. It's going to be some rich people. It's going to be journalists that are willing to be poor to do that. I think that what I would love to see change, I think will continue to change, is, because we paywall a fair amount of content, like about half of it, and often in the article, I'm always encouraging other people to paywall, because I'm like, if you create a culture of people paying for content, stop funding these big NGOs. They don't need your money, and just pay for your independent journalism. I think the other thing is, I have to say something about Elon Musk here, because I think a lot of us were very suspicious of him, and I think there's understandable reasons to be. I actually criticized his views on renewables, which I don't agree with. But when it came to this fight in Brazil, we released the Twitter Files Brazil, and 3 days later he said, yeah, the censorship is out of control there. And I don't think he ran that by NewsGuard or GDI or got permission from Disney or Procter & Gamble before doing that. It just took somebody as powerful as Elon Musk.
That's the paradox, isn't it? You need these outsized, incredibly rich and powerful people to sort of break the middle layer of corporate money. I mean, in this example that we've just been through, I literally got text messages from senior C-suite executives in big companies that we had tried to get as advertising partners, expressing their solidarity, how appalled they were. What is this ridiculous GDI? I read about it in the Times. Why are we giving them money? This is absurd. They should be shut down. I said, well, actually, we had an ad campaign agreed with you, and then mysteriously it got cancelled because of them. Why don't you reinstate it? Silence. Every comms person in every organization, whether it's a public sector organization or a company, is trained to avoid controversy, because the internet is so frightening and toxic, and you just don't want your brand near anything that is controversial. So even if we kill off the GDI, surely new equivalents will just sprout.
Yeah, but why? Because the GDI is downstream from government pressure. So the issue is not just corporations wanting to play safe and take the middle road. Of course they do, and they always have, right? That's a perennial problem. The real problem here is government corporate collusion. Organizations like the GDI exist because the government disinformation effort has opened up a space for them to operate effectively as sort of outsourced third-party regulatory arbiters. So, you saw this in the U.S. first with the fact-checking industry, right? So there was explosion, and this speaks to the financial pressures on journalism. Journalism in the U.S. has been cratering for a quarter decade. You know what the growth industry is? Fact-checking, right? Why? Because there is money being pumped into the fact-checking industry from the U.S. government and from the oligarchs.
And big tech as well, who outsource their efforts to this.
Of course, big tech and the big tech oligarchs are pumping money into this as a way to control the news industry. So the fact-checking industry in the U.S., which is one of the only growth industries in journalism, right? The rest of journalism, a few exceptions like what Michael's doing, but the rest of journalism is an industry is cratering. Fact-checking is growing, and the
maybe staffed by people who didn't make it as journalists.
Yep,
or people who might have been good sort of mid-level functionaries, or maybe even people who in a different world could have been good journalists. Who knows, right? But what they are doing as fact-checkers is not journalism. What they are doing as fact-checkers is operating as party apparatchiks. They are enforcing the dictates of the party. Now, they might be doing that through nominally private or non-profit entities, but those private and non-profit entities only exist downstream of the regulatory and policy environment created by the government.
So actually, it comes back to, there was House of Lords Committee. They don't have any power, really, but they have a little bit more power than people who aren't in the legislature. If you could tweak the incentives at the government level and put more pressure on the idea of free speech and maintaining that, cross-partisan, not having a kind of single ideology, being skeptical of these kind of censorship efforts, do you think that would actually make a difference, or are we...
Huge difference. Yeah, no, I mean, we can't stop Soros, Omidyar, and Craig Newmark from funding these NGOs.
Funders of CDI, I believe.
Yeah, I'm sure.
Of course.
But you can cut the the U.S. government funding for all of that censorship garbage at the Department of Homeland Security, FBI, National Science Foundation should all be cut. I mean, that's a huge priority. I mean, it's the banner on my X profile page is defund the thought police. We should be defunding it. So I think it would make a huge difference. There should be a clear directive from the prime minister or president or heads of state saying no state funding shall go into any censorship of American or British citizens. So I think there's actually quite a bit to do. I mean, I pretty much agree with Jacob that the state is taking the lead on this and that the big companies are basically following them. I mean, we're also noticing a pattern where the Soros Foundation will fund a bunch of NGOs in a country and then the U.S. Embassy will come in afterwards and fund them. You know, often organizations doing fact-checking and anti-disinformation work and whatever. So there's clearly some partnership going on there that we don't completely understand. But yeah, basically just defunding it would take us a long way in the right direction, because I don't think that those big corporations that refuse to advertise you, those CEOs aren't spending every day thinking about how to censor their enemies. But these government bureaucrats that Jacob's describing, they are doing that. They spend a lot of time meeting and having conversations about how to silence their political enemies.
Final thought for you. This is how meta and sort of baroque this battle is becoming. I read in a glowing profile in the New York Times last week that a new entity has been created by someone called Nina Jankowicz, who was, for a very fleeting moment, head of President Biden's Disinformation Governance Board for the 3 weeks it existed before he shut it down because it was considered too Orwellian and like a Ministry of Truth. She has now created something called the American Sunlight Project, which is to fight anti-disinformation. So we're getting very kind of hard to follow here, but she believes that organizations, and I'm afraid she would probably include all three of ours on this, that are attacking the disinformation movement now need their own sort of rapid response unit, which she has been good enough to provide, to come after them. So there's this sort of union of anti-disinformation entities that now has a new spokesman in this lady, Ms. Jankowicz. Do you have any thoughts on this? Things are getting out of hand.
Well, I might be one of the only people in the world who's read Ms. Jankowicz's book. So to bring this full circle, what you learn from her book, which focuses on her experiences in Eastern Europe, is that was the laboratory. So what Michael was describing a moment ago.
She worked for President Zelensky.
Prior to that even, she had been focused on the anti-Russian disinformation fight in Eastern Europe. And who, along with the U.S. government, was the primary funder of the anti-disinformation efforts in Eastern Europe before 2016? Mr. Soros's foundations, right? So what you had was a laboratory in Eastern Europe conducted both through NATO, the two principal vectors were NATO and the defense establishment on the one hand, and then the U.S.-aligned nonprofit, sort of parallel State Department nonprofit groups run by Mr. Soros and a few others, but Soros was really the key player in Eastern Europe. And that was where a lot of this was tried out initially. And I'll, to plug my book for a second, I'll get into all of this in detail.
Is there a title yet? Do you want to?
No title, but it'll be coming out from Holt sometime next year. It'll be sort of on the secret origins of the war on disinformation and what it portends for the future of free people and democratic politics. But Jankowicz, this is how she sees the world, right? So she looked at Eastern Europe as a laboratory of this, was horrified at the time by the people who were dissenting from the disinformation efforts in Eastern Europe. So she talks about, there was an anarchist professor in the Czech Republic. There are a few other figures, some left-wing figures, some right-wing populist figures who were saying, we reject this disinformation censorship because it's an infringement on free speech and freedom. And also, we don't think this is an effective response to Russian militarism and aggression. And in fact, maybe it's even a distraction from effective responses to Russian militarism and aggression. And Jankowicz in her book is not only promoting anti-disinformation, she's also attacking the critics of these early anti-disinformation efforts in, 2015 in Poland and the Czech Republic. So this has there's a precedent here.
I don't know if you've followed this, but far from being a kind of clandestine operative in Eastern Europe, now she's very much presenting herself as a Twitter celebrity. So she's quote tweeting anyone who has said anything mean about her new organization with a sassy Taylor Swift lyric, kind of come at me, kind of overt, quasi-political, almost AOC style social media campaigning as the celebrity champion of the anti-disinformation movement. For me, that's like yet another step of this, where
the security state girl boss.
Yes. Yeah. So it sort of drops all pretense of being a serious, neutral. It's not even pretending to be technocratic anymore. It's now just an overt political campaign.
Yeah, I think it's a step down from where they were. I mean, I think we should remain vigilant. That's a big part of what we need to do. But the censorship industry is deeply weakened now. I think the Twitter files had a huge impact. I think the Weaponization Committee in the United States had a big impact. We see them in a way that we didn't before. Nina Jankowicz can tweet her heart's content. She's not going to win back the trust that she permanently lost. And she's not willing to do the things that she would need to do to win back the trust. Another of the big censorship leaders is Renee DiResta. She has a book coming out that is basically an attack on people who go viral. So you have these people that are out there now kind of licking their wounds in public and saying, oh, woe is me, basically playing the victim. I mean, that's what they've done now for the last, here these were people where they had created elaborate secret bureaucracies to censor at a mass level, and they're now going out there saying, oh, they were picking on us by revealing what we're doing.
They're developing a vaccine for viral content.
Yeah, exactly. So I don't want to be overconfident, but I also think we should continue to trust that in a place with strong First Amendment protections, in whatever happens at the Supreme Court, where there's an important case, but I think we still have and as long as you have a free social media platform like X, I think if X were to somehow become a censorship platform, I would become much more pessimistic. And I'm very worried that it all relies on a single person, of course. But I do think that the internet is fundamentally like the printing press. After the Catholic Church, it used the printing press at first, but the Protestant Revolution, the scientific revolution, the Renaissance, these things became unstoppable forces with that new technology. And I think that's the same impact that
freedom will win the day in the end.
I do. I will just say that the printing press did usher in several hundred years of revolutions and war. So I think we do have a period of chaos ahead of us. But I think the internet is a very, very powerful tool that states aren't going to be able to shut down.
Michael Shellenberger, Jake Siegel, thank you so much. We are now all focused on this. I'm late to the party, but consider me joining the swelling ranks. We're going to meet together in London later in June. And we just need to keep a laser focus on this and then see what we can do next. Thanks, guys.
Cheers.
Thanks for having us.